In the last few episodes, we've taken a piece of basic code written in 1979 to generate a maze randomly and transition that into a piece of C# that runs, still with GOTO statements, still not in a clean and ideal state, so the refactor continues. In this stage we're going to take the piece of extra code we added just to animate the maze while it was being generated, as demonstrated in the previous video, and decouple that, allowing it to be injected at runtime and utilised optionally by checking to see if it exists, i.e. is not null, before making calls. As we near the end of this refactor, testing this visually shows that it still works as it did before. In this section, I'm going to make this code slightly more readable by introducing better named variables, introducing functions for the commonly used calculations, to try and give this a slightly better flow. This isn't going to remove any of the GOTO statements, but it should start to give us a better idea of what the code's doing, which will help us when we come to refactor it to get rid of those GOTO statements. You may have noticed in this that resharper doesn't actually detect the repeated calculations and change all of the instances. This is a feature that's been asked for in ReSharper and hopefully will eventually come soon. You'll notice here I'm trying to use a Lambda expression or link query to determine whether all the blocks have been visited. Continuing from the previous journey, I'm going to try and consolidate and make some of the logic better, again making this flow slightly better, but still not removing the GOTO statements just yet. Some of the variables are in fact Boolean, but are using integer values of 1 and 0 to represent true and false. In order to put that right and enable us to use better logic, I'm going through and changing all those variables to be Booleans. Having those characterization tests that we introduced in the first video allows me to fall back. In the case that I make an error, I can detect it, correct it, or undo it and redo it as required. It's also worth noting that all these functions have been added as local functions, so they are in effect functions within the original function. This has the advantage that they still have access to the local variables declared in the parent function. Tests also provide a way of doing small experimentation to try and find redundant code, try and find code flow and how it's actually working, because I can comment out sections of code, run the tests, see if that causes a problem or not, put it back in and carry on. So now this is a relatively tidy and well named and readable piece of code, as best as it can be with those GOTO statements in it. I'm now going to condense all these GOTO statements and convert them into conditional blocks and loops, completely removing the GOTO statements and turning this into something that looks a little bit more like code we would write today. Again, using the tests as a way of detecting errors we've made in refactoring early, and if necessary, undoing what we've done and redoing it. Having that confidence to just make changes, because you can always get back to where you were within a few presses of Ctrl-Z, means the refactoring is done safely, and we're fairly comfortable given that 98% code coverage we actually had from our characterization tests, that these tests are going to protect us against breaking the inner function of this maze code. One of the major changes that's required to this code is to split the code that actually decides the direction the maze is going to go in from the code that actually edits or changes the maze. Doing this allows us to have a loop, which means we can decide a direction and then change the maze. And those two pieces of code are not entirely, but are slightly decoupled by doing this. You may have noticed I've been trying to track down an error in the refactoring that's causing the test to fail. This actually turns out to be something very simple, and there should be a break or an else clause to one of the if statements. It's a very simple mistake to make, but one that was causing me a little bit of trouble trying to find it. As we reach the final throes of this refactor, rerunning the code coverage shows that we've actually got 100% code coverage after a few tweaks. This means that the 5 lines of uncovered code we found before were in fact redundant. We've got a piece of code that is written in C#. It doesn't have any GOTO statements in it, but it's a long way from what we'd consider clean code, and is a far cry from a decoupled architecture. This means that there's still somewhat of a journey to go to get this code into a state that we'd consider to be acceptable by today's standards.